Tucker and Greenwald exposed that the right is now pro-censorship when it comes to the Middle Eastern war. We know that the left are pro-censorship because of the last 3 years of COVID and Ukraine censorship. So, does either party believe in free speech anymore? Hello there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom. Today we are discussing the legacy media and both political parties' adverse reaction to your free speech and your free thought. This comes off the back of a brilliant conversation between Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson, where they talk about the escalating Middle Eastern tensions and how that's created a kind of aptitude and even acceptance of censorship on the right that previously was not there at all. Does being pro-free speech always mean being pro-speech that you're opposed to, willing to listen to alternative and opposing ideas that you're explicitly against, but accept that in principle you have to hear? Let's have a look at them talking about it, and then let's look at the normalization of censorship that's taken place across the world in the last few years and has led to a spate of legislation, cancellation, shutting down of dissent, and normalizing the unpersoning, cancelling, definancing, and control of ordinary citizens and entire political movements.
What's so terrifying to me, though, is that the right, the American political right, which really was through this kind of weird transformation that's happened over the past dozen years, has become the lone defenders of the First Amendment. They've abandoned that in the last month, like instantly. So I think you could say, you know, I strongly support Israel. I strongly dislike Hamas. I'm rooting for, maybe I think we should commit troops to the region. I mean, whatever. You can have any view you want. However, American citizens have a right to express their opinion, period. And that supersedes any other event in any other country. It's like that's a core right. And I don't hear many conservatives saying that. And so you sort of wonder, like, if they're not defending it, who will?
I mean, there are people who have built their careers, Tucker, over the last 5-6 years, standing up and saying, we can't have cancel culture. We can't have censorship. College students aren't entitled to feelings of safety. We don't censor in order to protect people from views they find threatening, mocking the notion that minority groups are vulnerable and we have to censor in order to protect them. Turn on a dime and now become the leading voices saying, because American Jews feel unsafe, that's valid in a way that, say, claims from black people or LGBTs or Latinos aren't valid, and because of that, we need to censor.
Well, principles are expensive. In the end, these principles and values ultimately might mean personal or ideological sacrifice. In fact, if it doesn't involve that, it probably isn't a principle. It's probably a kind of tribalist alliance, perhaps. Let me know where you stand on that ideological musing in the chat below. Let's see how in the last few years censorship has been normalized on the left, and it created a kind of new political movement. And to tell you the truth, I feel like I'm part of it, where it's, oh, I don't care anymore whether you think you're left or right. What I believe in is your acceptance of other people's right to organize their own community and say what they believe in. And I don't agree with harmful speech or hate speech. Those things are abhorrent to me. But I do agree with the view of people that I'm opposed to. Otherwise, that means you don't agree with free speech. Let's get into this in some detail. It's true that during wartime, governments sometimes censor and restrict liberties, including on the basis of ideology, race, and religion. But after governments have done so, societies almost always regret what occurred. After 9/11, the FBI abused its powers and entrapped Muslims. After Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the rounding up of Japanese Americans. These are moral stains on our history. Keeping military secrets is one thing. Demanding censorship of even ugly, awful, and offensive speech is another. People are saying revolting things. They must remain free to do so, not just because the First Amendment requires it, but also because talking back to hatred is ultimately the only way to overcome it. And while the suppression of free expression always starts with the least popular speech, it never ends there. Yes, it does seem, just on my experience in the last few years, that certain figures were taken out of the culture, but over time that has escalated to include more people and more ideas, and it's been a kind of expanding remit of ideas and speech and individuals that can be censored and shut down. Have you noticed that yourself? And in a way, even though free speech necessarily means hearing speech you don't agree with, that's an easier sacrifice to make than its alternative, the ongoing implementation of ever-increasing censorship, particularly when you suspect from movements of power elsewhere in the world that there's a desire to centralise authority. I'm talking about legislation for censorship, online safety bills, the bill in Canada, the bill in Ireland, EU's proposals, the introduction of CBDCs that primarily seem to be beneficial because they can be controlled and shut down. I suppose taken in context with the apparent agenda to increase authoritarianism, this increase in censorship via challenging free speech on the basis of hate speech is a trend that has to be observed. And I suppose it's surprising, isn't it, that people that had built their career around it, or people that were determined that free speech was everything, suddenly abandoning it. That's curious, isn't it? A month ago, France banned all pro-Palestinian demonstrations in the country. On the same day, Germany banned a pro-Palestinian protest group. In the UK, the Home Secretary instructed police to consider taking unspecified measures against such actions as chanting slogans and waving a Palestinian flag. In the United States, such measures would clearly violate the Constitution. Such state suppression of political speech is anathema to American values. But in the United States too, our commitment to free speech is being tested. Within hours of the attacks, a number of Harvard student groups signed a letter placing blame for all violence in the region on Israel alone. The apartheid regime is the only one to blame, it read. Bill Ackman, a billionaire hedge fund manager, demanded that Harvard release the names of all the student members of those groups so that he could compile a hiring blacklist for his CEO friends. Someone on Twitter compiled such a list himself, called the Terror List. Later, a truck began circling the Harvard campus with digital billboards displaying the names and faces of students alleged to have signed the statement under the title Harvard's Leading Anti-Semites. Websites popped up listing student members' names, pictures, social media profiles, class years, hometowns, and former employers. Republican Senator Josh Hawley said he hoped the Department of Justice was investigating pro-Palestinian student groups like the ones at Harvard. The Harvard students weren't the only ones who faced real-world retaliation for their views. An NYU law school student saw a job offer rescinded for expressing a sentiment similar to the one in the Harvard student group letter. NYU's Student Bar Association voted to remove the student as president. The Philly Voice fired a sports writer for tweeting solidarity with Palestine always. Do you recall at the beginning of the ascent of Jordan Peterson that he said, what's happening on campuses now will spread to the culture and you'll start to see this tendency towards cancellation and enforced speech and prohibition of speech. And it was obviously, you all know how Jordan Peterson is regarded in the culture. Some of you now, because of Jordan Peterson's position on this war, might have changed your perspective on him. But I feel the principle that Jordan Peterson was talking about was essentially free speech and refusing coercive speech. Now we're in a position where we're sort of normalizing cancellation. We're normalizing actions that don't seem to have due process behind them at all. It's just like these people signed this list. I don't know. Wouldn't you be happy to be friends with someone who is pro-Palestine or someone that's pro-Israel? Is that for you a line? I mean, I noticed that this got exacerbated during Trump. It was like a kind of joke thing. Oh, what to do with your relatives that are pro-Trump at Christmas? And already for someone my age, that was an exaggeration and an amplification of the ordinary tensions that were in any family. That any family would have people that were a bit conservative and some that were socialist, unless you were in a very particular community where everyone's a docker or works at a coal mine or something, then you would live in a very sort of insular, tribalised community. But it was accepted that we didn't need to be so opposed to one another that we wanted the government to step in and censor speech on our behalf. Like when you show your kid a movie and it's like, oh, this is meant to be a PG movie or a 12 movie, and you think, well, this movie, I'm thinking it's particularly of Little Shop of Horrors, shouldn't be a PG movie, it's too crazy. But then I think, well, I am still in charge. I can just stop my kid watching this movie if I want to. We have power at the level of the individual. We have power at the level of the community. I wonder what is lost by empowering the state and other agencies to shut down, in particular, free speech on our behalf, just because in this instance we happen to agree with it. There's certainly been a lot of things said about me lately that I wish had been shut down, let me tell you, but hey, free speech. All of this is legal in the United States. Much of it is protected speech, but it's hard to deny, at least without moving goalposts, that the backlash is as clear an example as one can find of cancel culture. The purpose of exposing and punishing each of them personally is the same as when left-wing activists dox and shame their enemies to make anyone who thinks of voicing even moderate dissent, such as criticising the scale or conduct of Israel's military response, think twice lest they be punished too. Meanwhile, the same publications that have dismissed and denied the reality of government-funded, government-demanded and government-coerced censorship are raising the alarm about widespread censorship of progressive voices on social media platforms. It's one thing we can agree on, that we all want to be healthy healthy and stronger, and that's why we use Field of Greens. And it's finally here. The fieldofgreens.com Black Friday sale is on, and it's incredible. Right now, you can get 30% off when you use the code VIP. Guys, I love Field of Greens, and so many of you have been seeing incredible results. More energy throughout the day. I'm energized. Skin looking healthier. Digestion better than ever. My stomach, hey, wait a minute, it's magnificent in there. Hairs and nails are growing faster and look healthier, and overall, I feel better and more able to participate in reality. I hereby pledge to you that this will be one of the best things you add to your life for better health. Don't miss this massive sale and get up to 30%, that can't be right, 30% off your order. That's an incredible discount, isn't it? 30%. Visit brickhouserussell.com and use promo code VIP for up to 30% off. So go to brickhouserussell.com and use the promo code VIP for 30% off. Let's get back into this. In its story on the censorship of pro-Palestinian voices, the Washington Post expresses great skepticism of big tech and sympathy for the people censored. The exact opposite of how it treated the issue when it was non-leftists who were being censored. In fact, the Washington Post, like most news media, spent years denying that censorship was occurring, even as they called for more of it. To be sure, there has been a concerning increase in demands for censorship and blacklisting since the October 7th Hamas attacks. Government officials are threatening to defund colleges for things students have said and are even demanding their expulsion. The state university system of Florida incorrectly warned that calls for Israel to be wiped off the map are criminal activity. And political officials, including the Attorney General of New York, are demanding greater censorship by social media platforms to stop the spread of violent rhetoric. I'm reminded of how the Section 702 bill introduced as part of the Patriot Act after 9/11 is used to spy on American citizens using skullduggery and manipulation. And they've spied both on Black Lives Matter activists and participants in January the 6th. When it comes to the deep state, when it comes to real power, what we regard as extreme and polarized position, like the example I just offered you, Black Lives Matter, January 6th, that seems pretty extreme in American political culture, well, they'll be subject to the same kind of exploitation of surveillance and I would assume censorship and other measures of control that I strongly believe will be introduced if people aren't able to have open conversations about very contentious and in particular incendiary subjects like Palestine, Israel. Unless people can have an open discourse about that without being censored, unless you can have a workplace where people that are pro-Palestine and people that are pro-Israel can find a way to work together, I don't actually see a way forward, because in the end you'll have to say, well, we're not doing that, and we're going to create more polarity, more tribalism, and ultimately in so doing you empower centralized authority, which is garnering authority at an extraordinary rate in a bunch of ways that aren't initially obvious, but like the WHO proposed treaty is something you should look at, the legislation I've already mentioned around the world, the increasing surveillance powers, the tendency towards censorship. And many people believe, and I'd love to know what you think about this, that free speech is the fundamental right, because without free speech you can't have free thought, you can't have open communication, you can't have real relationships. You have to live in a kind of ongoing perpetual dread that what you believe might have you unpersoned at some point if you were ever to express it. That's a real good way of exerting control. And to tell you the truth, that's the kind of tyranny and authoritarianism that scares me more than the last iteration of militarized tyranny, although I'm actually scared of all forms of dictatorship and tyranny actually, I suppose. But this is what seems to be the trend, a kind of sanitized, shutting down, an agreement in principle that that sort of speech is unsayable, that that sort of person should be cancelled. I think once you legitimize that, then you've essentially empowered the establishment to kind of do what it wants. But the alarm that the news media are raising is in striking contrast to the indifference at best and hostility at worst to the evidence of governmental and non-governmental censorship of a variety of disfavoured views and voices relating to climate change, COVID, Ukraine, and the Biden family's influence peddling. For years, the left has insisted that cancelling, blacklisting, shadow banning and censorship were legitimate actions to punish people with unsavoury views, protect safety and fight disinformation. Now that the left may be on the receiving end of these tactics, they argue what many of us have been saying all along. Censorship causes far more harm than good. But the left is yet to acknowledge its double standards. Why is that? So everyone's just swatched sides, so no one actually cares about anything at all. I mean, isn't that worrying? Doesn't that suggest that we're not going to be able to find a way for, let's just take the example of American democracy, because it's such a significant one, to not bypass, but to get through the 2024 election cycle successfully? It seems that at best there's just going to be ongoing mudslinging by either side. And isn't that the problem that's been in our culture since at least the build up to 2016? And it's getting worse and worse, and no one's doing anything about it. There are no solid principles where we say, well, at least We all agree on that. Increasingly, that's disappearing from our culture. The simplest explanation for the left's hypocrisy on censorship is simply that they favour free speech for themselves and censorship for their enemies. Evidence of this can be found in virtually every mainstream news article about the Twitter files. Last December, The Guardian even acknowledged that the Twitter files showed censorship, but that such censorship should be welcomed because it was against the political right. Like so much to do with American politics, opined Guardian's tech columnist Alex Hearn, the files fall flat if you view the American right as an outlier. If you have rules against election misinformation and only one party engages in a systematic campaign of election misinformation, it's not an unreasonable outcome for one party to be the focus of moderation efforts. But that's simply not the case. We know that both parties engage in misinformation. Misinformation just used to be called propaganda or campaigning or media manipulation, or whatever you want to call it. It's simply not a uni-party issue. For years, Wired magazine insisted that misinformation and disinformation resulted in real-world harms, including the election of Trump, and that more social media censorship was needed. But now, Wired says, it's censorship, not misinformation, that's causing real-world harm. Palestinians claim social media censorship is endangering lives, reads the headline of Wired's piece denouncing social media censorship of Palestinians in Gaza and around the world. TechCrunch dismissed the Twitter files thread by Barry Weiss on the shadow banning of disfavoured voices because it only shows examples of moderation actions that affect a handful of conservative fringe accounts. The so-called fringe accounts included that of Stanford University professor Jay Bhattacharya, a leading global thinker on how to respond to pandemics. But such one-sidedness should be problematic for all journalists who claim to be fair and for advocates of free speech. After all, it's not advocacy of free speech if the free speech is just for your team and not for your opponents. Most people on the left do not appear to realise that they are contradicting themselves by lamenting censorship of pro-Palestinian voices. Today, former President Barack Obama called for a respectful dialogue between people who disagree on Israel. But just 1 year ago, Obama urged greater social media censorship of views with which he disagrees and called for the US government to create a regulatory structure to limit speech online. Since 2016, the left has increasingly espoused a tribal rather than liberal approach to politics. In fighting what they viewed as the threat of fascism and white supremacy, the left decided to, in large part, do away with the basic principles of liberal democracy and to apply different speech rights and even legal rights to different people on the basis of a friend-enemy distinction. All of this is thus bad news for anyone who cares about free speech for all and protecting liberal democracy. It shows that many of the people who are ostensibly committed to free speech, whether on the left or right, really only support it when it's for their group. It reveals that underneath our rationalist minds there remains a highly tribal reptilian brain. In the face of the horrors that have occurred and those to come, we must not lose our humanity and our principles. It's possible for every one of us to have compassion for innocent people on all sides. It's also possible for every one of us to defend free speech for the views we most abhor. In so doing, we care more, not less, and keep the possibility of peace and security alive, however remote it may be at the moment. I suppose the abandonment of generally accepted principles at a time of crisis can only exacerbate those sets of crises. It's long been obvious to me that principles and values were being weaponized, used to persecute people, to shut down debate, to create conflict. What I suppose we have to look at is how our willingness to put aside our own principles and values when it's convenient to us are likely to affect society as a whole. It's a very difficult thing to hold in your mind and in your heart, what it is to observe the sanctity of the individual, the beauty of your individual connection to whatever higher reality or deeper purpose you believe in, and all of our shared duties towards community, whether that's at a local or a global level. The problem I think we're experiencing as culture becomes banalizing, anodyne, as well as, curiously, highly conflagratory and conflict-driven, is none of us feel particularly connected to reality anymore. When you are allotted a role in a culture that ultimately leaves you simply as a consumer or an online activist, it's easy to feel disconnected from reality. It's easy to feel disconnected from principles. It's easy to feel disconnected from the environment and conditions that we evolved in. I feel that where possible, we have to look for ways to emulate the conditions we evolved in. Communities where we understood one another, where we knew that we had a shared purpose, where we recognise there are different tribal groups with whom we have a broader shared purpose. Recently I heard the phrase, curiously, from one of the creators of Wikipedia, unified but decentralized. It seems to me that if we have true democracy, if we have true individual freedom, if we have true freedom of speech, we are going to be able to create a culture where open conversation, civil disagreement, diplomatic solutions again become possible. The more we are in conflict with one another, the more we're willing to put aside our principles because temporarily it's convenient for us, the more likely it is that the advance of establishment elites that benefit from conflict will continue. The example I used of surveillance being applied to what are regarded as outside, alien, or undesirable groups, whether that's from the left, Black Lives Matter, or the right, January 6 protesters, shows you that to the institutions and groups that are truly in power, our division is absolutely vital. Our willingness not to hold fast and firm to principles is a great weapon to people that ultimately benefit from censorship, shutting down of free speech, centralizing resources, and passing edicts that bypass democracy entirely. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the chat below? Have a look at this video. Remember, we stream at these times every single weekday on Rumble. You can join us there whenever you want, but more important than any of that, if you can, please stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.